I can't.
It's okay if you can't see it because it's tiny. It's fine. Oh, backwards.
All right, I'm gonna click live. Wait, not yet. Sorry,
Hi,
not
everybody.
yet, not yet. Sorry, not yet.
Oh.
I just wanted to make sure that I can see what I made.
Hi, everybody. I'm just trying to make sure that I've got the CN Tower. Can you see that I'm in Toronto? There we go. CN Tower behind me. I'm at the Lake Ontario shoreline. My name is Raya, and I am super excited to be greeting you today from Tommy Thompson Park, which is a wilderness space in the city of Toronto. So today we are going to be talking about microplastics, but before we get to that, I wanted to share a few kind of housekeeping details. So first of all, if you have any questions or if teachers have any questions from students that you'd like to put in the chat, please do so. We have folks on the back end who can answer in the chat, and then anything that we don't answer or if you want us to expand on, we can answer at the very end. We'll have a Q&A. And if you have the worksheet, so Janelle can pull up the worksheet in a moment just to show what it looks like. If you have the worksheet, that's great. If you don't have the worksheet, no problem. And you can always get it after. We'll put the link in the chat for where you can request the worksheet. We have a few people helping on the back end as well. So Janelle, come on back and say hello. Janelle is managing the tech. So you'll hear me asking about Janelle pulling some pictures up. And we've got Jasmine here as well. Hello, Jasmine. You can say hello.
Hello, everyone. So excited to be here with all of you this afternoon.
Awesome. All right. Oh, in regards to the chat, I should mention, if you are using the chat yourself as a student, just remember, of course, that we want to be respectful of it. We don't want to be goofing around on the chat. We want to make sure that it's a community space that we're all sharing. And but do ask questions, and we're happy to have you react to some things you see if something kind of strikes a chord in you. So I mentioned that our theme is microplastics, but I'd like to start off first by sharing a little bit more of where we are and talking about, like, backing up a bit and talking about ecosystems, because there's a lot of close connections there. So I'm going to turn my camera around a little bit. Every once in a while, there's a boat that goes by and makes it loud, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me still. But we can see that I'm right at a shoreline here, and that's one side. And then as we scan across, we've got Lake Ontario here and going to the other part of the shoreline that I'm at. So I've mentioned the word shoreline a couple of times. And when we think about shorelines, maybe Janelle, you can pull up that first picture. When we think about shoreline ecosystems and what they are, well, we've got water, like an aquatic ecosystem, a lake, a pond, a wetland, an ocean, potentially, and we've got land. And this is where they meet. And these kinds of ecosystems are very unique because the organisms who we can find in shoreline ecosystems, they usually need sort of both land and water to survive. And it's a really interesting meeting of two other ecosystems. So if we look up more closely at our shoreline ecosystem or the shoreline space, you can see in this next picture that there's a lot of vegetation, right? Vegetation coming out of the water. The soil in shoreline ecosystems tends to be quite wet. And so the plants that live there need wet soil. And these plants in this picture, it looks like they're actually growing from underneath the water, but they're emerging from the water. So we have these emergent plants in these ecosystems. Now, let's think about who might live in these ecosystem communities. Starting off with this one. So you might say dragonfly, right? It's a dragonfly. Now, technically it's a damselfly, but they're very similar. And dragonflies and damselflies both fly around in the air as adults, but they spend most of their life cycle underneath the water, in the water. So underneath the water surface. And this is a picture of a damselfly laying eggs on the water surface. But the eggs as they hatch, the young damselflies or dragonflies, they're called nymphs. So that stage of life, they live in the water and they need to have healthy spaces to live to get the food and the shelter they need. And then they'll crawl up on some plant emerging from the water when they're ready to become an adult. So they'll crawl up, hang on tight, shed their exoskeleton, and out flies the adult from that phase of life. So this is one example of an organism who really relies on healthy shoreline and aquatic ecosystems. Now, another one is a turtle. Look at this adorable snapping turtle. I was lucky enough to be around shortly after some snapping turtles were hatching out of their nest. And in this moment, this turtle probably hatched like an hour or two before this photo was taken. This turtle was crawling over to a shoreline. So they hatch on a terrestrial landscape, like from a hole in the ground, basically, where they were laid. And then they make their way to a shoreline and they need a healthy spot to crawl into the water. So we can see this next turtle, or same turtle, later on, crawling into the water. They need to find shelter, so they need some healthy vegetation in that space, and they need to find food, right, to survive. So we need to make sure that the spaces are healthy for both those parts of a habitat. Moving on, and then if they are lucky enough and don't get run over or predated on in their long life, then they could end up being this really healthy, beautiful adult snapping turtle. All right, next up we have, where'd they go? There we go. We have fish, right? There are so many fish in Lake Ontario, and you might think, Raya, they're usually out in the middle of the lake. They're not on the shoreline. And you're right. A lot of the times fish spend time further out in the deeper waters, but this time of year, and when fish are spawning, they will come closer to the shoreline. They need that shallower water in order to spawn, in order to lay eggs. What we're seeing here is a baby pike, this really long fish. It's a predatory fish. And so these baby fish, again, they need these healthy aquatic ecosystems in order to survive and do well. And the next one, frogs as well. We've seen frogs maybe, or pictures of frogs at least, in water, but also on land. So they spend time in both kinds of spaces. Shorelines are great for them. And next one, I'm hearing birds all around me. I don't know if you can hear them too, but in this picture, we've got an example of a bird called a trumpeter swan. And these are their babies, the cygnets. So swans and other birds rely on healthy aquatic and shoreline habitats in order to find material to make their nests and in order to find food. So all of the wildlife we've just shown rely on these kinds of spaces. And today, we've now thought about, okay, these are all kinds of organisms, and there's many more I didn't talk about who rely on these spaces. But today, we're actually going to focus more so on one of the threats to healthy ecosystems. I hope that the lapping of the water isn't too loud behind me. We've got some waves hitting the shore. Maybe I'll angle the camera down. You can see, whoops, wrong way, Raya. There's the waves hitting the shoreline right here. So when we're thinking about threats to healthy aquatic ecosystems and healthy shorelines, one of the threats is microplastics. And you might be thinking, Raya, I've heard the word microplastics, but I don't exactly know what they are. So I'm going to show you a photo here. And this is my hand. I took this photo, was it about 3 or 4 years ago? I was actually at Tommy Thompson Park, and there was a lot of flooding that year. I don't know if you recall. So much flooding that I was walking kind of in a forested space that led to a beach, that led to the waterfront. And so I was walking through this trail on this forest, and the trail was flooded. And I dipped my hand in the trail and scooped up what was there floating in the water. And this is what came up in my hand. And if we look, we can see that there's some organic vegetation, but there's also non-organic material there, lots of little tiny plastics. There are fragments, there's a foam piece there, that white chunk at the top, kind of left corner. And there are lots of these pellets, which are called Nurdles. We'll talk about them shortly. So lots of different little tiny bits of plastic have floated to the shoreline in the water. So if we think about what shorelines, let's go back up, next picture there, yep. So when we think about these shoreline spaces, those plastic bits, well, they might have come from people littering at Tommy Thompson Park, but more likely they came from other spaces and ended up in the water and then, like with the waves behind me that you just heard, lapping onto the shoreline. So when we think about microplastics, well, I said that they're tiny. There's actually a measurement that's been determined for them. So microplastics have kind of been defined as plastic pieces that are less than 5 millimeters in diameter, essentially. And they can be different shapes, but less than 5 millimeters. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to turn my camera around here. Give me just one moment as I fuss and fiddle. I'm going to show you a specimen collection of microplastics. Oh, that was a loud bird. Technical difficulties. My camera is not letting me flip it. One moment. Okay, we might do a little bit of improv here. So strange. Usually my camera is able to flip. Okay, so I'm going to show you these microplastics in this jar here. And these were collected using a special net called a Newston net that kind of comes across the surface of the water in the inner and outer harbor of Toronto to get these kinds of samples. So when people analyze shoreline samples or water samples, then they have to acquire those samples using a particular kind of net. Still trying to flip my screen, not working. Okay, so I'm going to show you the shoreline that I'm at. We'll see what it looks like up close. And to get there, I'm going to have to go to a slightly lower level. Here we go. I'm going to turn my camera around. And Janelle, feel free to come on and let me know if something is not in focus, since I can't see the screen at this point. Okay. I'm going to turn my camera around. So we're looking down, down, down at the actual shoreline. And we'll get zoomed in right in just a moment. Here we go. So as we look closer at the plastic on the shoreline, maybe you can even make out from this distance that we're seeing a lot of larger chunks of plastic. But as we look even closer, we can see that there are some smaller pieces as well. And as I come up to the top of the shoreline here, we're seeing what looks like it might have been from an old bottle cap right over here. And here we go. Do you see this little clear piece that I'm pointing to? Hoping my camera is pointed in the right place. So this little small clear piece here, and I'll see if I can find some more. Those were the nurdles I was talking about. And nurdles, instead of coming from objects that we might use in our lives, which I'll show you in a second, these are little tiny bits of plastic that never actually became anything that we would use in our own life. So these little tiny, tiny pellets. If you, for instance, run a rubber duck factory, then you're not the one who extracts the plastic from the oil from the ground and refines it to plastic and processes it. You instead order plastic pellets called nurdles from other spaces. And you then take those plastic pellets and you melt them down or add color, do whatever you need to do to create the product that you make. Here we can see there's a large piece here that hasn't broken down yet, but look at this. There's actually all kinds of muscles that have attached to this piece of plastic here. So they've kind of really entered into these ecosystems. I'm gonna bring the camera back up. Sorry about the tech difficulties, my friends. Oh, and now my camera is letting me switch the view. So I mentioned nurdles being plastics that, little plastic pellets that hadn't actually become a plastic product yet. Imagine that you're shipping nurdles to a factory that makes some plastic product, whether it's a container of some sort or rubber ducks. And at the factory where they're being made, sometimes I imagine when they're washing the floors, maybe some go down the drain, or somehow I've heard incidences of them coming off the truck, causing problems that way, and then entering these aquatic streams, these rivers, aquatic ecosystems that then make their way to Lake Ontario. Other places where plastics can come from, maybe you recognize this kind of container. So lots of food containers and other containers made of plastic. It's very light, it's cheap to make, but again, might go in the recycling or end up in a landfill. On the way, sometimes these sorts of plastics can end up being broken apart. Maybe it ends up on the street, little pieces of it go down the storm drain and end up in our aquatic spaces. If any of you are athletic and like to wear kind of sweat wicking sort of clothing, like a shirt like this, then I don't know if you've looked at the labels to recognize what's in there, but let's have a closer look here. I'm going to pull it back a bit so hopefully you can see. We've got polyester and spandex, and I think there's nylon in that one. And those are all different types of plastics. Now, what happens when you wash your clothes? Well, in the washing machine, some of the microfibers come off of clothing, and they end up in the water stream as well, which then gets sent back into Lake Ontario. Nowadays, people switch their phones out every few years, right? Or maybe even every year, some people. I try to hang on to mine as long as I can. With our phones, though, to keep them from breaking, we often get phone cases. And a phone case like this, well, that's made of plastic. And once we get a new phone, we no longer need the old case. Where does that end up? Probably a landfill. Maybe some of them can be recycled. But a lot of the times, these fragments, through that journey of going to the landfill or going to recycling or getting tossed somewhere else, they end up as well on the streets, in the storm drains, or maybe as litter, right? And so they get into streams and rivers, which then lead into the Great Lakes. And what happens with these plastics is as they break up, they don't biodegrade. People hear about plastic biodegrading. It doesn't actually happen that they will biodegrade, and bacteria can't really consume plastic on a mass scale. So what happens instead is that the sun beats down on these plastics in the water and makes them more brittle. It's a process called photooxidation. So it makes them more brittle, and then they'll eventually break down into smaller and smaller pieces, but they don't completely disappear. They just get into smaller and smaller pieces and end up, now I can switch my camera. And so they end up being in these ecosystems like the one we just talked about. All right, there we go. So you can see in this jar sample I showed earlier, we've got plastic in there. I think there's even a little blue nurdle right there, kind of a gray-blue color. And did the shoreline turn out okay, Janelle, or shall I do a quick revisit?
It looked fine, but if you want to look again, it's fine too.
Okay, well, I'm glad it looks fine. I'm not going to go back. I just couldn't see what I was showing. So we've seen that shoreline. Oh my gosh, can you believe it? There's even something that looks like a plant, but it's actually a plastic little leaf that has drifted in from somewhere. What are the odds? Oh, and that's something that an organism could easily mistake for food. Now, I'm going to head over to Jasmine to show you what she has to share. But on the way, I wanted to mention that as plastics are breaking down, we see those larger pieces there. As they're breaking down, they might start off larger. And these larger plastics can have an impact on animals as well. So Janelle, if you can pull up that next picture. There we go. We have a mallard duck who's been caught up in plastic. And this is just one example of thousands, millions of animals who have suffered from plastic injury in some way, some shape or form. And then the plastic eventually further breaks down and probably causes other problems. So you can come back to me, Janelle, and I'm going to show you what Jasmine has set up here. We have set up a little outdoor laboratory because we want to look at these microplastics up close. So we have two types of microscopes. We sometimes use this kind of microscope to see things up close out here, but we have a different kind of a microscope so we can actually show it to you as well. So Jasmine's going to share with you what these objects look like up close.
Thank you, Michelle. Here we go. So taking a look at our microscope here, we're using one that connects right to the computer, so we can really get a good look at what we're seeing. And so, of course, with microplastics, we need to use these magnifying tools to help us get that closer look and really see what they look like up close. As Ryan mentioned, these microplastics are less than 5 millimeters in diameter, right? So that's pretty small. So we're seeing here, I have our microscope pointed towards some organic material. And so that jar that Raya was showing earlier that was collected from the Lake Ontario shoreline, that's actually where this sample that we're looking at right now came from. So we're going to see a lot of organic material as we move through here, but we're also going to see some microplastics as well. And I want to start off by showing you this piece of microplastic right here. So having a look at this, and I'll see if I can get it in focus, we can see what shape is that showing up as. So it's kind of this perfect circle. And this is one of those kind of 3 main types of microplastics that Raya talked about earlier. This is a nurdle. So kind of that first part in plastic items life is as a nurdle before it gets melted down and then shaped into an object that we might use. And so having a look at this is not the only nurdle that we found in our sample. There are lots along here on the Lake Ontario waterfront, and there are lots in this little sample here as well. If we kind of come over here, you can see here are 2 nurdles kind of melted together here, and we can see those kind of perfect circular shapes. So that's how we know that they're nurdles and not fragments, because they haven't kind of broken down and they don't have those jagged edges. All right, let's see what else we can find in this sample if we take a closer look. And you'll notice they look really, really big up in this microscope, right? But in reality, these pieces are so small. They're smaller than the size of my fingernail on my pinky finger, so quite small. All right, let's keep looking. And I want to show you a different type of microplastics. And I'm going to start by showing you this piece right here. And so what we're looking at here is one of the largest pieces of plastic that we have in our sample. And I'm showing you the top of it. And on the side, I wonder if you can see those ridges. So having a look at that, everyone, what kind of plastic item do you think this may have came from? So this is a fragment. It's not a whole piece of plastic. It did break off of another plastic item. And looking at kind of those ridges along the side, this makes me think that this might have come from maybe a bottle cap or something similar. But it's a really big piece of plastic. It's almost the size of my whole thumb tip. And so this one maybe is not so much a microplastic. As Rye was mentioning, what happens to these kind of larger fragments of plastic, as they get brittle through photooxidation and they break down, they become smaller and smaller. So let's see if we can find some smaller fragments in our sample. We're moving through. Those are the nurdles we looked at earlier. And if we keep looking, okay, here's another piece of plastic that we can have a look at. And so this one is also quite big. Let me see if I can get it in focus there. So this is something we wouldn't be able to see with our eyes, but using our microscope, we can actually see the numbers that have been printed on to this fragment of plastic. And you can see the edge there, and you can see how it's kind of been broken up and how that edge is so jagged. All right, if we keep on looking right over here, here's one of those smaller fragments, this tiny little piece of green plastic, and look how jagged those edges are. So this piece of plastic is very brittle. It's likely that it's been in our aquatic ecosystem for a really long time, and it's continued to break down bit by bit further and further. And so like Raya was mentioning, these plastic fragments, they break down bit by bit, but they never really go away. They just become smaller and smaller. And so when we're looking at trying to remove some of these plastic items from our environment, maybe one of you has participated in a litter cleanup before, that can be pretty easy when we're grabbing water bottles and other large items of garbage that are polluting our environment. But it can become a lot trickier as these plastics become fragments, become microplastics, and break down into these very, very small pieces. All right, so we've looked at nurdles, we've looked at fragments. Let's keep on looking and see what else we can find. We're looking at a lot of organic material here. And if I bring you over here, have a look at this. What is that? Check it out, my friends. Do any of you know what organism this came from? Let me focus in and get this very clear for you. And as we're focusing in, feel free to write your guesses in the chat. Oh my gosh, look at that structure. So this, what we're looking at right now under magnification, is a snail shell. And this is one of the aquatic organisms that we accidentally picked up in our sample. And so it goes to show that our kind of shoreline ecosystems, like Raya was talking about, are full of life, right? They're full of so many different aquatic organisms and living things that really rely on having these healthy ecosystems in order to survive, including this snail here. And I just think it's so cool to take a closer look at that shell and the way it's structured. All right, let's keep on exploring this sample. If we come over here, I want to show you something that I found pretty cool. And so, taking a closer look right here, let me see if I can get into focus. All right, here we go. So this might not look like a whole lot. To me, it kind of looks like a piece of stone, like maybe a piece of marble. You can see it has some texture there. Raya told me that it looks like teeth. The edges of this look like teeth to her. But this is actually a piece of styrofoam, and it's a really small piece of styrofoam that's probably broken off a larger piece, and it will continue to break down. And by looking at this, we can kind of get a clue that this is a piece of plastic that's been in our aquatic ecosystem for quite some time now. How do I know that? How can I tell that? Well, have a look at what's growing on it, right? We can see this algae that's completely growing all over this styrofoam. And so that's a really good indication of how long these plastic items will stay in our aquatic ecosystems. They'll continue to break down and continue to pollute our environment. Now, we've talked about nurdles, we've talked about fragments, but there's one last type of microplastic that I really want to show you. So I'll keep moving along. We can see some wood there, some more organic material. And if I bring you a little further, this is the smallest microplastic that we're going to look at today. And here it is. My friends, does anyone remember what these microplastics are called? So these are fibers. And we had a look at that kind of athletic shirt earlier, but this is a fiber that might have come off of that shirt or a fabric that's similar. And so like what Raya was mentioning, a lot of the materials in these shirts are plastic, that polyester, that spandex, that's plastic. And these fibers that come off that shirt are not biodegradable. And so they break down and they unravel into these very, very, very small pieces. If I bring you over here, I want to show you an organism that I found in this sample as well. Check it out. So this is a macroinvertebrate. Macro meaning that I can see it with my eyes. It's very, very small, but I can see it. And invertebrate meaning it doesn't have a backbone, so it's very small. And there are a lot of macroinvertebrates that live in aquatic ecosystems. But having a look at this and comparing it with those blue fibers that we can see right beside it, you can tell kind of how small these fibrous microplastics are and how they could enter into the ecosystem and enter into the food chain at a very low level, right? Imagine what this macroinvertebrate might be eating. Imagine, in fact, what plankton might be eating, which are some of the smallest organisms that we can find in the waterways here in Toronto and in the GTA. Plankton are so tiny, and as they're scooping up water and feeding, they might accidentally eat some pieces of plastic like these fibers that we're seeing here. If that's entering into the food chain at such a low level, then as we move up the food chain, where is that plastic going? Maybe that plankton is being eaten by other insects like this macroinvertebrate that I've showed you. Maybe it's being eaten by fish. And as it moves further and further up, maybe that fish is being eaten by a fox or by a coyote. Maybe it's going all the way up to some of the top predators in the food chain or some of the largest animals in the food chain. Think about humans as well. So we fit into that food chain, right? If plastic is entering the food chain at the lowest level, eventually it's going to make its way up. And it could even make its way up all the way to us as well. All right, so we've had a really good look at our sample here. I think that's all I wanted to show you. We looked at the 3 different types of plastics, fibers, fragments, and nurdles. And I'm going to pass it over to Raya now.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And now we could have even shown more because the foam was another kind of foam fragments or other types of fragments. Pellets, they have been We used to use a lot of pellets in like exfoliation products, right? Little plastic pellets, and they've actually been banned from use in particular products in Canada. So that's a good thing. So, you know, we can expand on our knowledge of microplastics by spending more time looking into it. So now that we have this knowledge, right? You've learned about microplastics and ecosystems and the impacts that these threats can have on the ecosystems. The next step is always, you know, what action can I take? Is there an action that I can take? And so maybe there are things that you already do to limit your plastic waste kind of impact on natural environments. Jasmine and I are going to share some ideas that we've come up with for our own lives and things that we've sort of adopted into our lifestyles. Now, I want to mention that these are not, it's not like I woke up one morning and decided to do everything perfectly, and I don't do everything perfectly. It's kind of a gradual shift in like, what changes can I make that will decrease my impact? So we'll start with you, Jasmine. What is something that you have do in your life cycle rather to decrease your impact?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Raya. So I want to talk about kind of how I act as a consumer and the different things that I buy. In particular, I want to talk about clothing. And so Raya showed you that athletic shirt earlier, right? And she showed you that tag with the different types of plastic that make up the fibers on that shirt. So that's actually my shirt. But I didn't actually buy that shirt brand new. I bought that secondhand. And so almost all of the clothing that I'm buying nowadays are coming from secondhand sources, and even the clothing that I'm receiving. Maybe I will share my clothing with my friends or receive clothing from friends that they no longer want. Maybe I'm getting clothing that's being passed down to me by family members, or maybe I'm going to stores, thrift stores, and other areas where they're selling these used clothing that have been used by other people. And I can buy this clothing to kind of continue its lifespan. And that's what happened with that shirt there. And so when we're thinking about these items of clothing that have a lot of plastic in them, we can think about how much energy it takes to create them, and then how often these items of clothing go right into our landfills and right into our environment, and kind of the pollution that that can cause. By reusing these items of clothing that have been kind of used and donated by others and are no longer wanted by others, by kind of cherishing that and treasuring those items, we can increase the longevity of these items, and we can reduce the amount of clothing that is being produced on a day-to-day basis and the amount of plastic that is being used to create those clothing items.
Excellent. Thanks, Jasmine. Now, one of the things I do, I looked at, okay, what am I using every day? And I eat every day. I think hopefully most of us do. And so food, what are some ways in the food aspect of my lifestyle that I can decrease how much waste I'm producing? And I started thinking about the most common foods I eat. So I'm not a big cook, and I cook a lot of pasta because it's easy. So pasta, I don't need to get it in cellophane bags anymore. I go to bulk stores and I fill up my jars with pasta. And so that way there's a lot less plastic involved in that product, right? The bulk store probably gets it in a big plastic bag, but if you divided that up into a bunch of little cellophane bags, it ends up being less plastic by buying it in bulk than buying it individually packaged. So that's one item. And then something else that I really like having coconut shavings on my yogurt and my ice cream, things like that. So I also get coconut from bulk stores. That's another one that I pick up. And of course, I'm reusing jars from pasta sauce that I buy. I actually have a list on my fridge that is titled Items to Solve For. So what is something that I eat, but maybe I'm not able to find it in bulk, right? And one of those things, it was just a bunch of months ago now that I found a place that actually carries it in bulk. And that was ketchup. I was like, I eat ketchup, but I'm always getting in these containers, these plastic containers. And this place, I just went there yesterday, and so I picked up some more. So I get my ketchup in jars now. I pay a deposit for the jar. Sometimes I'll just scoop it out of here when I'm using it. I also have a little thing that I'll put it into so I can squeeze it out. And then I return the jar when it's empty, and I get my deposit back. I'll get a new jar of ketchup, and so they reuse the jars over and over. Now, the last one I brought to show you is actually not a food item. This one is kind of in another part of household products, right? And this is dish detergent. And you might think, Raya, who are you trying to fool? That is a container that you bought. Try to get it out of the sun there. That's a container you bought of dish detergent. It is, you are right. But I bought this about 4 years ago, and I've been refilling it at a bulk place ever since. So for 4 years, I haven't needed to buy a new hard plastic bodied container of dish detergent, which reduces the amount of waste that I'm putting out there. So when we think about these sorts of containers, we often think, well, why can't I just recycle it? But recycling, while it's better than filling up landfills, it still takes a lot of energy to have the trucks circulate and pick up the recycling. A lot of it's not sorted properly, and so it ends up going in landfill anyway. And in a lot of cases, the recycling, once it can be recycled into products to a point, and then there's a point where it's no good anymore. So if we can reduce how much we're actually creating into the waste stream, that's even better. Jasmine, do you have another one that you do in your life?
I do, yeah. So hearing you talk about that food, that's so inspiring to me, right? I had no idea that like they made ketchup that was refillable or reusable. That's so cool. And yeah, thinking about kind of the ways that I grocery shop and the kind of tools that I use to reduce the amount of plastic I'm using when I go grocery shopping. This is something that probably many of us do at this point, but I never use the plastic bags in grocery stores. Every time I go grocery shopping, I'm bringing along 3 tote bags with me. My canvas totes, they go with me everywhere I go. And that's how I collect all of my items from the grocery store, and that's how I take them home. Another kind of common use of plastic in grocery stores is when we're getting our produce, when we're getting maybe our apples or our oranges or our avocados, and we're collecting those in bags, right? They have those little plastic produce bags. So instead of using those, I try to use smaller kind of canvas bags that I can use many, many, many times, instead of using these kind of single-use plastic bags that rip really easily and aren't really usable for a lot of other items. So I'm still working on reducing my plastic use, especially when I'm grocery shopping and purchasing food items. But there's little things that we can do bit by bit to kind of, like Raya was saying, kind of solve for some of these challenges where we see ourselves being less sustainable than we'd like to be.
Awesome, Jasmine. That sounds so great. I wanted to share one last one, and this is to do with my neighborhood. So we actually have a pretty tight-knit community in our neighborhood, our geographical neighborhood, and there are some neighborhood online groups that I'm in, and so people share ideas. And thankfully, there are people who have ideas I've never heard of, so I can learn from them. And then I also learn about different ways to reduce my impact, and so I can share that with others. And alongside that, then we also sometimes share items that we no longer need. And Jasmine might laugh at this because whenever we're cleaning out an office space or cleaning out one of our storage spaces, there are things that other people might be like, oh, we don't use that anymore. Nobody needs that. That's garbage. And I'm like, I can find somebody who needs that. And so even like a paper towel roll, people might think, Raya, just recycle it. But pretty often there might be a teacher who teaches a grade 1 or a kindergarten class, and they're like, I want to make binoculars with my kids, out of paper towel rolls. And so I hang on to these because I see those posts come up every couple of months, and then I can say, I've got a bunch for you, and we can extend their life. And that way the teacher also doesn't have to buy something that the students would use to do the craft. So there are lots of great ways to share not only ideas, but also actual items in your neighborhood. Something that might seem like garbage to you is something that to somebody else is actually an item they can use.
Oh, that's so cool, right? And hearing you talk about that really makes me think of this kind of larger idea of environmental stewardship as a whole. So reducing our plastic use means that we're being environmental stewards. And stewardship is kind of a big word. Some of you may have heard of it before, but being a steward essentially means taking care of something that doesn't belong to you or doesn't belong to us. And so when we think about this idea of environmental stewardship, it means taking care of the environment and taking on a personal responsibility to make our environment healthier, right? The environment doesn't belong to us, nature doesn't belong to us, but it's our responsibility to take care of it and make sure that it's healthy, not only for us, but also all of the other living things that share this space with us. And the reason why I wanted to talk about that, and the reason why you made me think about that, is because environmental stewardship is not a solo project. It's not something that I can do alone. It's a community effort. And so it's really a project of working together with others, sharing not only ideas, but also resources, items, really anything we can share to work together as a whole. By working as a community to perform environmental stewardship, we can have a much larger impact, and we can really make a change in kind of the work that we're doing and making our lifestyles more sustainable and more eco-friendly as well.
Absolutely, Jasmine. I 100% agree with everything you just shared. Everything that Jasmine and I have talked about, I said in the beginning that these weren't like overnight shifts that we made. We have kind of been on our own timelines thinking about how can we lessen our impact? And it really comes down to shifting our mindset in order to make these decisions. So by looking at the world from a bit of a different perspective, you know, you're at the grocery store and recognizing like, oh, that plastic packaging, it doesn't end, its life doesn't end when I get rid of it from my house. It's still somewhere, right? So shifting that mindset into kind of a broader view of how items cycle through our lives, that's a big part of it. And in general, just incorporating these factors into our decision making on a daily basis, by shifting that mindset, can gradually become second nature in lessening your impact. So kind of thinking second nature in coming into your decision making is what I'm trying to get at here. All right, so we're getting near the end here. I wanted to check in with you and have you wonder for yourself, like, is there anything that we've shared, any ideas that we've shared that you've connected with? Are there any things that we shared that you already do maybe? Or maybe there's something that we've shared that has sparked your thinking and you're like, huh, I wonder if that would work for me too. Do you have other ideas that could work in lessening your environmental impact or your plastic waste? We're going to put a link in the chat if you'd like to read more about microplastics. There's always more information, more studies coming out, so you can read more about it and learn more about not only the problems, but also the solutions potentially. And I have a challenge for you. Now we're going to switch over to taking questions from the chat in just a moment, but I'm going to present this challenge first. And this is that I want you to, later today, whether around the dinner table or walking home with a friend, share something that has come to mind, whether something you heard or something you came up with while watching this live stream, that it's kind of like a new way of thinking, of being mindful of plastic use. So share this idea with somebody else in your life today. Hey, I just heard about this thing, or did you ever think about how we're using this and how it's going to impact, you know, ecosystems later on? So some way that what we're using in our life ties in with the natural world in the GTA, whether you're in Peel or York or Durham. Think about the connections between our lives and the lives of wildlife based on our plastic waste. So, like I said, we'll take some questions. If you need to go, I'm noticing that we're already at 40 minutes. So if you do need to go, then it's been wonderful having you join us today. You can also watch this live stream later on. Our next live stream is coming up June 15th. It'll be on pollinators for grades 1 to 3, but anybody's welcome to tune in. So tell your younger siblings or tell your teacher colleagues. And there's a link to that live stream in the chat coming up as well, the event posting for that chat. But Janelle, have there been any questions from our students and teachers participating?
Yeah, so there was one question that came in so far, and the question is, what can young people do to avoid plastics when parents are buying most of their things?
Excellent question, because that is something that, yeah, as a young person, you might be like, I don't make the decisions, but you can influence the decisions your parents make. You can help them, like guide them through learning about the impact we make based on what we buy, right? Like I said, with that challenge, if you can share something you've learned with somebody else in your life, that might make them kind of take a step back and consider what they're purchasing. Or if there's something that you always get as a household unit, your parents are always buying something, maybe you can find a place that sells it in a way that there's less plastic, and then tell them about it or offer to do the purchasing for them. So, I mean, maybe they'll have to lend you the money, but or give you the money for it, but you can go out and get it. So by helping with doing the research and sharing what you've learned, you can actually help influence your parents' decisions.
It's so true. And there's really a lot of different kind of creative ways that you can start to reduce your plastic use. Something that me and my friends do pretty regularly, kind of on a yearly basis, is we get together with all of our old clothing and we do a clothing swap. Because like I was saying before, a lot of the clothing that I don't want anymore, my friends will love. And so that's a really fun way to kind of be more sustainable with some of the items that we're using. And it doesn't involve money. It doesn't involve purchasing anything. It's just about kind of adding new pieces to your wardrobe without actually going out and purchasing new clothing items that were produced and made using plastic. And so that's kind of one idea of a way to be creative and be more sustainable, but I'm sure you can think of many other ways that you can kind of reduce your plastic use as a community, maybe in your school or with your friends, as well as what Raya mentioned in your household.
Thank you. I think those are all the questions that we have for now. So maybe we can wrap up. But feel free to add more questions in the chat if you have any.
Terrific. Thank you, Janelle, so much. And I want to thank you again, everybody, for tuning in today and learning about this important topic. There are so many amazing aspects of natural spaces, and we have to be mindful of what the threats are and what we can do to minimize those threats. So, like I said, I encourage you, I challenge you to share a new way of being mindful of plastic use with somebody today in your life, and keep thinking about these concepts. And if you are, like I said earlier, sorry, I get distracted by the birds around me. I don't know if you've seen them flying behind me. There is another one. I get easily distracted by them. And if you have a younger sibling, or if you have a colleague who teaches a younger grade, then tune in on June 15th. Go to trca.ca to find the event for our next live stream on pollinators. We'll be in the Meadowway broadcasting from this amazing meadow space in Scarborough in the east end of Toronto. So thank you for joining us, everybody, and have a wonderful Wednesday. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.